And I put it to you that after lockdown and so on, people are rightly more nervous, sometimes in a conspiratorial way, about what the consequences of such a system are. They've been exposed to so much incompetence, so much expenditure like track and trace that you referred to that just
Mhm.
went up in smoke, like PPE. Are they going to buy it the same way they did in 2018? I don't think so.
Hello and welcome to Reasoned UK with me, Darren Grimes. I'd absolutely love it if before watching today's content you could hit the subscribe button and the little notification bell that resides next to it if you enjoy today's content. It'll help ensure that you don't miss out on any future conversations. And folks, times are hard, we all know that, but if you're fortunate enough to be in a position to support our work here at Reasoned, ensuring that we can keep our independent voices online, we'd be very grateful indeed. Every little really does help. Now, on with today's show. This week, Tony Blair, he's back, remember him? He's been bleating on about ID cards for decades now, often in the face of fierce opposition from his Tory opposition. Such opposition scrapped his national ID card scheme back in the coalition government in the early 2010s, and then Home Secretary Theresa May reportedly had the hard drives storing our information gobbled up by a grinding machine in Essex. Then came the pandemic and Blair was back, arguing that vaccine passports meant it was time for such ID. And then, earlier this week, he teamed up with the bloke that he used to spar with on the opposite side of the House of Commons, William Hague, to make the case once more for digital ID. The pair produced a paper together via Blair's Institute for Global Change, which sounds pretty awful to me, but anyway, this paper was entitled A New National Purpose: Innovation Can Power the Future of Britain. And one of the flagship proposals in this paper was the idea that our smartphones, just like this one, should contain a designed digital ID, arguing that in the age of the on-demand economy, in which you can find a date or scroll through Twitter pretty easily on one of these things, would actually ensure that you can have everyday essentials like your public services through your passport, your driving license, your tax records, your qualifications, all held on a device such as this one. Now, the journalist Ross Clark, who we had on this channel the other week, he reckons that this is a step towards China's Orwellian social credit system. He asks if the British state has become any more capable of doing big IT projects such as this one, as the days since Blair wasted 10 billion quid on a scrapped plan for digitalising the NHS, for example. Let's not forget that the NHS Covid app had tens of billions of quid, the track and trace one, tens of billions of quid spent on it, and it wasn't exactly brilliant either. So joining me to discuss this is James Woodhousen, Visiting Professor of Forecasting and Innovation at London South Bank University. He's a specialist in IT, pretty handy for today, energy, and in Asia. James, thank you very, very much for your time today.
Good afternoon.
Now, James, first of all, what do you make of this intervention and, frankly, obsession by Tony Blair? Is he right, or do his own IT failures in government actually suggest that this is a hiding to nothing?
Well, it's a very big and quite complicated question, Darren, but I think it's important, because of all the detail you can get into, just to stand back for a moment. I think you're quite right to say that it's an obsession on his part. The track record is there to show that. In fact, there were 5 attempts by Labour Home Secretaries to introduce national ID cards. But I think what it also shows is perhaps 3 things, really. First of all, a desire for sort of seamless efficiency. As soon as you hear the word seamless, you've got to question it. In the state sector, we all encounter lots of inefficiency,
Mm-hmm.
but to believe that one system can embrace us all and make everything so easy leads me to the second point, that he and William Hague know nothing about IT. In fact, the more people rave about IT, the more distant from the hard end of the soldering iron you can be sure the that they are. And I have a quote from Blair from 2005, in fact, showing him using the hunt and peck method, with a keyboard, which is like that. And the quote is, "There is not me doing it online. No, I have to say, this is internet use. I apologise for that. I have a few other things on my plate." And that leads me to the third thing, that if you look at the William Hague points that he's been making, it's not just that they have this ridiculous hope in a seamless efficiency in the public services, and that they are very ignorant but extremely idolising of IT. They also believe, this is what Hague said, that we're living in the fastest period of innovation ever. Given they know so little about IT and innovation, they're all humanities graduates, these enthusiasts. They ought to have a look at the Victorians, because you don't have to go in for Victorian morality to appreciate that they innovated much faster than us. That today's innovations, where TikTok is the greatest thing since sliced bread, there are some important innovations, but in IT, most of them are trivial. This one is not trivial, and it would help a bit if we stood back from it and, just understood how ignorant, obsessed, foolish, and dangerous these proposals are.
Well, before we get into a bit more of that, it also strikes me, James, as being completely premature in that a tenth of UK adults, I think it was the last count, actually don't own a smartphone. So how would they obtain this technology if we digitise all of our lives in this way?
Well, that's a very good point. In fact, the figure I have is 4 million have no access to the internet. That it's not just they don't have a smartphone. They may not have a computer. They may not have broadband wired up if they're in remote areas. 4 million out of 60 plus million is quite a lot, actually.
Yeah.
And the experience with the Indian system, which is called Aadhaar, if I pronounce the Hindi right, it means foundation, is not just that it's premature. I mean, they're trying to, cover 1.2 billion people. That's their ID system. But they are not reaching northeast India. They're not reaching Meghalaya, however you say it, or Assam, that we know from tea in northeast India. They're not reaching 8% of the population. So it can't reach all of the people, and therefore, by its nature, it's going to be, I hate to use the phrase, Darren, on your show, but it is going to be non-inclusive. It's going to discriminate against the vulnerable. There's more than 70 million children in India who don't have the system, even though that there are 16 states that give ID at birth, and they're now trying to make that a whole national phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean,
so it's not just premature. It won't work. It hasn't even worked with a relatively simple system to begin with when Congress introduced it in India in 2009. It has many critics in India. And the fact that they never reference this, or that the darling of the liberal left, Shoshana Zuboff, in her book Surveillance Capitalism, hundreds of pages, no mention of state surveillance pretty much throughout the book. We'll come on to surveillance and conspiracy theories, but no mention of the Aadhaar system whatsoever. It's all Tesco she's worried about.
Yeah, but then Blair said in his interview with BBC Radio 4's Today programme, which is very funereal in its approach, if you ask me, but, Blair highlighted how countries like Estonia have been actually having success stories as far as digital ID is concerned. Do you reject that argument as well?
I got to look at Estonia. When you're as old as me, you have to confess when you don't know something. And I've not looked at that. But let's get a little closer to the issue. There's another thing which will play to your right-wing sentiments if right-wing meant anything, Darren, which it doesn't anymore. Everybody's right-wing who doesn't agree with The Guardian. But that famous phrase, do turkeys vote for Christmas?
Yeah.
Well, you got this sort of inverse here, which is, do civil servants vote to leave well alone? our identity systems are not very well, and like most of government IT, they're not very well. There's some good examples. I'm able to know everything about my blood through Kingston Hospital online. I was quite astonished, when I looked there. But the general rule is fax machines, and the disaster that was the electronic patient record system (EPR) to which you refer. So, why should we have confidence in their competence in general, and especially over this?
I
Why
agree.
are
I
they?
agree.
Why are
But
they proposing it exactly?
that's a good question. I mean, Nick Timothy, though, the former number 10 Joint Chief of Staff under Theresa May, he's actually argued that ID cards, and whether they be digital or physical, would be useful in actually tackling and addressing illegal immigration. Now, most people I know do carry, James, some form of ID with them. I mean, I do because I still get ID'd, but, I have to. But if
When you're going into a pub,
oh
they
yeah,
think you're
yeah,
under 18.
exactly. Or in a shop, even. But I've been ID'd buying a can of bloody Red Bull, for God's sake. But going in to buy paracetamol or whatever else it might be, or as you say, going into pubs and things like that. If a lot of people are already carrying ID, might be just to get in the car on a morning. Surely, in addressing something as serious as the small boats crisis that we're seeing, if we can actually take away the way in which people can get into Britain and then just be lost in the system, if ID cards could prove to do that, surely that would mean that they would have mass support because so many are so concerned about illegal immigration.
Well, it's good to make the counter argument. In sales, we call that anticipating objections. So if we're hostile to ID cards, as I believe you are, and I certainly am, we have to know what the arguments for them are, and we have to know how to, anticipate those objections and then deal with them. It might be an attractive prospect. I'm an internationalist, but I believe in the nation state. No contradiction there. I think a properly organised a visa system for immigrants, if I'm allowed to use the word, migrants, refugees, or whatever you want to call them. You're in another country, you apply for a visa, you fill out N million forms, some of them requiring English, we could debate that, and then you get in or you're not let in. What's new in show business? That's one thing. It's another thing to believe that we can really control illegal immigration and terrorist immigration through some electronics. That's really foolish. Do we not know the phrase gaming the system? Do we not know, the phrase everything is unhacked until it's hacked? These Albanians and their smuggler gangs and so on, the ones who are really, the bad guys, not all of them, but quite a lot of them, they're no slouch in computers and in IT. The Russians probably better than us about a lot of that, right? Eastern Europe, Ukraine was very strong in cyber attacks. So I think it's illusory to think, especially with the current civil service, which is so woke, that, a little piece of plastic with some electronics is going to solve illegal immigration. They might sell it that way, Darren, to appeal to the mass of the population. Don't believe the hype. Really don't.
Well, speaking of that hype, in 2018, YouGov found that a majority of Brits actually do support introducing ID cards. So doesn't this just show that, objections to it is a libertarian fringe that's out of step with the public, James?
Well, anything published by YouGov is immediately suspect, and you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to know that. Go to their website, find out what they're up to, who's behind them, and so on. And that's not conspiracy; it's freely available public information, right? The second thing is, I think after lockdown, that poll in 2018,
Yeah.
it's going to be a little bit different now. I think when you've seen the whole panoply of anti-democratic measures. And again, we can come to conspiracy theories because it's important to dispense with them.
Yeah.
Right? Very important. But, you take smart meters. What's been revealed about smart meters over the past few years, and you take low traffic networks, Chinese CCTV cameras, all the rest of it. You add it all up, and again, I don't want to join the dots. There's nobody, there's no WEF, no World Economic Forum behind, my friendly neighbourhood CCTV camera. That's all rubbish. You add it all up, we're living at a time when infringements on democracy, primarily made by the state, not by a patriotic alternative and a few really right-wing headbangers, but by the state, they're on the move in every direction, and they're cheered on by the media. And in this respect, the digital ID idea, long dead. It's a bit like the end of that movie Carrie by Brian De Palma. When the villain, the horrible villainess is buried, and girl goes along, put flowers on her grave, and a long bloody arm shoots out of the gravestone to get her. That's what we're faced with. And you look at the people advocating it; they're similarly dangerous and satanic.
Well, it's a former, sort of technocratic politicians, like Blair, like Rishi Sunak, like William Hague. I get that argument, but I would put it to you, though, James, that there is a real authoritarian streak in the British people. We saw that with lockdown, where there was almost we want it harder, we want it faster, we want it, all the rest of it to actually curtail our freedoms and liberties more and more. I actually struggle to accept that there wouldn't be massive support for such a scheme as this.
Well, if you look at the people on our side, no wonder we're losing the battle, because we don't have, apart from Silky Carlo and Big Brother Watch, and Toby at the Free Speech Society, and people like Toby Young. As you know, Darren, I grew up with the left. I'm really appalled by the left today. That doesn't make me right wing, but I think the liberal left has offered no serious arguments against digital ID. It's in fact mostly cheering it on, because it thinks that working class people on estates who are guilty of antisocial behaviour can be lifted faster that way, and that's a big sort of threat that it's got subconsciously at the back of its mind. So I think we mustn't rush to judgment on the British public. If you ask the British public 20 or 30 years ago, do you favour capital punishment, you'd have got a nasty answer. We can debate that, but things have changed, and I put it to you that after lockdown and so on, people are rightly more nervous, sometimes in a conspiratorial way, about what the consequences of such a system are. They've been exposed to so much incompetence, so much expenditure like track and trace that you referred to that just went up in smoke, like PPE. Are they going to buy it the same way they did in 2018? I don't think so. And if we make the right arguments and we anticipate objections, we can easily sway the population. On the older and better left, where 50 years ago, when the left actually had some ideas and read some books, the idea was that if you weren't winning the argument, that was your fault, not the population's fault. You didn't say, look, there's a big authoritarian streak in the British people. Look at the way they've welcomed Ukrainians. Or look at the mass objections to Hong Kongers. They never did any of that. They said, come on in. Even Nigel Farage said, let the Syrians in. We could debate immigration, right? But the British public, if you look at YouGov polls or something better, we're about, you can't buy it, but, and we've got problems to solve. But in racism, compared with Europeans, we come out pretty well in the polls.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to be horrible to black people on a bus the way they did 50 years ago. You get a big upsurge against that on the bus. And the bad thing is the police would be called instead of us dealing it with, the population so ignorant, so authoritarian. They're not always like that, Darren.
Yeah.
I'm sure you can see that.
Absolutely. I do accept that. But I wonder then, let's move on to what some might call conspiracy theories, right?
Good.
And some of the fears around digital ID, around this new form of tech, they're arguing that actually it's in the same boat as you mentioned the Chinese cameras, CCTV,
Mm-hmm.
the elimination of cash, James, or
Mm-hmm.
central banks creating digital currencies, that being the route, the road to creating a Chinese-style social credit system. Are such fears, James, in your research, are such fears unfounded?
Well, there's no smoke without fire, Darren. You know, that's another old proposition from way back, right? That you can't just sort of dismiss conspiracy theories just like that, right? The social credit system in China, which I was one of the first people to write about seriously on Spiked, which I write for, Spiked Online. In fact, if you look at it, it's much more partial and not universal than you or I might think. Now, I hate the CCP, don't get me wrong, but their social credit system, there's some experiment, there's some, it's not a complete Jeremy Bentham panopticon where you can't move, and bat an eyelid without Xi Jinping knowing about it. They got about 1 million people, maybe 2 million people operating it, doing all that stuff. They got 90 million people in the Chinese Communist Party. Still, they can't do it, right? Because there's quite a lot of dissent in China. The working class there, the older people. You can go to the websites, you'll find that people don't like a lot of what the CCP is doing beyond the more recent demonstrations. So, as usual, the conspiracy theorists don't really know what they're talking about. You've got to actually look at China's thing with open eyes and know the defects of the system and so on. So I don't see it as being like that. I think if it says more about the worries and fears and obsessions of the ruling elite. All of these different measures, smart meters, all the things that you adduce, says more about them than it does about their competence to introduce something really sinister. The cock up is bigger than the conspiracy, especially in Britain, especially with the state, and especially with IT. Is it a danger to civil liberties? Yes. Is it CCP tomorrow? No. Come on, get a grip. But have we fought back against it beyond you, me, serious people like Silky Carlo and Toby Young? No, we haven't fought back about it. We haven't marshalled the arguments. That's what we need to do in a rounded, cool, step back kind of way.
Do you agree then with, because you mentioned artificial intelligence then, how, The Guardian and others are getting this wrong. It's not actually artificial intelligence of the sort of, you might view Terminator, the robot, right? It's actually quite basic tech that's been around for some time now. But do you agree with the argument that Blair puts forward in the report that says Britain is actually going to be left behind in the world of artificial intelligence and tech breakthrough if we don't actually look at these measures that could boost productivity?
Well, we're not very good at IT, not
Yeah.
compared with the Americans, and increasingly the Chinese, Korea, South Korea. Um, But I go back to what I said, which is that everybody likes to talk about innovation. They talk much less about productivity because innovation is more sort of sparkly and gleaming, and productivity might require hard work. And since they all favour working from home and 4-day weeks and all of that, the prospect of hard work, the work ethic, in fact, is something that they'd rather not talk about. So they talk a good game on innovation. They know nothing about it.
Hmm.
And we have pretty good R&D in this country, all things considered. We punch above our weight in science. We don't spend enough on it, and we need a lot more on what is called artificial intelligence, and the same as we do on cyber, energy, agriculture, medicine, all of these things, right? But they don't know anything about that. It's down to you and me to tell them the strengths and weaknesses, and not just to wave this technocratic vision. It's quite interesting if you look at what William Hague said. We need to redesign the state around technology. That's what he said. I mean, what he's pointing to is that when you and I, try to get a driver's license from the DVLA, they're all asleep. I jest, but the productivity there is poor, and of course that does strike a popular chord. There would, if you dangle that the digital IT will get you through that nonsense, of course people are going to buy it. But what Hague also said, which was so funny, they're so shameless, these people, is, quote, politicians need to understand its potential, the potential of IT and AI and all of it. He doesn't know anything about it, I promise you. He's ex-McKinsey, but he, just like Tony Blair was a lawyer, but it's not that there are not important advances. There are. The ChatGPT thing, which you need a whole program on if you haven't done it already, is an advance. But there was an old slogan before you were born, Darren. Rubbish in, rubbish out. In IT, and we're the ones who create it. It's not. It doesn't create us. We're the ones that create it. Therefore, it can be fallible because we're fallible. Even Darren Grimes is fallible.
Oh, very much so.
So if you're programming that new ID system, what could go wrong? And the answer is quite a lot.
I mean, I don't want to, because you're right, it would take an entire program, but I must admit that ChatGPT, the AI, you type in a question and or even, write me an essay or something like that, and it would come up with some collated text that it's gathered via algorithm and all the rest of it. But I worry about that because it has been shown that it has liberal biases. You'll ask it a question about Donald Trump and it comes out with, Silicon Valley views, James.
Yeah, sure.
So there's a worry. I don't think that's conspiracy theory because that's actually happening. That's taken place. So do these people have a point when they say, look, this is the road to madness. We've got to pull back before it's too late?
Well, in all of these things, it's not so black and white, right? The machine learning, which is the basis for what's called artificial intelligence, has made many advances. If you take cancer, you run through X squillion images of cancer, and you get a machine with electronics to, identify characteristics and learn from them and so on. You can save a lot of time. You can do stuff that humans can't do. Doctors can't do all that stuff. So it is an advance. But it might look like intelligence, but they're simple questions that, one must ask of all of these systems, which is, when a big machine wins a game of Go in the Far East against a human Go player, does it know that it's won? Mm-hmm. Does it at a moment of historical amnesia where everybody can't remember the 5 attempts of the Labour government to Labour governments to introduce ID cards, do those computers, artificial intelligence systems, have a consciousness of the past and a presentiment of the future? Now maybe they're mining Google and they can tell you which Labour governments did all of that. But is that the same as some kind of consciousness of history? Can they have a sex life? Mm-hmm. Can they kiss somebody and learn from that? Do they have religious persuasions? Do they have a spiritual dimension? Are they emotional? Does their liver tell them anything of a morning? Machines, I mean.
Yeah.
Right? Do they have any moral sense? Any sense of moral judgment? No. They are right now reflecting Silicon Valley liberalism, which has brought San Francisco to its knees. Mm-hmm. And that confirms what I said already. Rubbish in, rubbish out.
Absolutely, because the last thing I want, I don't know about you, James, but the last thing I want is a sort of Meghan Markle-like android in my flat. I can tell you that much for free. I'm sure some people would like that, perhaps, and maybe there's a market.
I think it's already here.
Yes. I wonder then, that question that I asked earlier, sort of hinted at it at least. If the government went ahead with this, right, if the government, Rishi Sunak, I describe him as a technocrat, James. I don't know if you think that unfair, but I would describe him as a bit of a technocratic politician.
Completely.
What would he view as a success story of the government's new Department for Science, Innovation and Technology as far as digital ID is concerned? If the Secretary of State, who I think is Michelle Donnellan off the top of my head, but if she as Secretary of State was to say, right, we're going ahead, full steam ahead with digital ID, you're going to have absolutely everything on here, Darren, what would she view as a success story? Would it be not spending billions and billions and billions of quid, tens of billions, which they inevitably would? Would it be not being curtailed by civil service incompetence? What would it be that the government would be able to say, right, we've done a good job out of this, actually? Because I imagine the Labour Party under Sir Keir Starmer would actually quite like these proposals too.
Well, I think they would, but what they would regard as a success, you better ask them, Darren, if they come on your show, because I've got no idea. That like I say, some successes are possible, right, and are a good idea, but the execution of the government, I support, or I did support, not the route or the rationale, but I support the principle of high speed too. Don't all leave the room at once. But, if you look at the competence that they've established over that, or not, the way they ran roughshod over lots of owners of commercial property, and the whole thing's ballooned in expenditure, any attempt to say, well, look, we're going to save X billion by spending just Y billion for a new ID system, is immediately suspect. Look at their modelling. Presumably they will model, the rollout, the take-up, the savings and all the rest of it of a digital ID system. And Rishi Sunak would tell some, big four accountancy pals of his, bean counters, to go and do that modelling. But you and I know that modelling depends on the premises, the assumptions of the modelers, and again, it's rubbish in, rubbish out. What would they regard? Well, I think a success would be some kind of IT system that shortened waiting times getting into the NHS, that shortened ambulance, visits and everything like that. And some of those things are possible. There's one important point to make, two important points to make, really, which is the ID system that they're thinking of will be more related to mobility than it will be related to round-the-clock surveillance, right? It's much more to do with road transport and other forms of moving in, as you've already hinted, in leaving the country and coming into the country. It's not about, just sort of watching you all the time. The bosses will do that when you're working from home through your keyboards and your keystrokes and so on. And the second thing is that, all the talk about ID cards, smartphones are really clever now. You've got two-factor authentication, you've got fingerprint authentication, you've got cryptography that's much advanced. In the medium to long term, you've got quantum computing. So we've already got an embryonic smartphone with different embryonic ID card, except it would be for particular situations, not a national mobility surveillance device that anyway didn't reach all the parts that Heineken used to reach. Those ads were before your time. But, it's not going to do that. It's not going to be universal any more than broadband or smartphones with which you began the tour, universal. But in certain limited applications, no problem. On the other hand, look at I don't drive anymore. They won't let me. But if you look at, local authority parking with your mobile, or to replace the coin system, right? It's true nobody has any coins, right? But don't tell me the mobile system is that much easier to somebody who's faintly out of town. If you get it wrong, you could be there for 15 minutes. And if you really get it wrong, you could be, hit for £160, right? For the parking, which is another thing they want to make impossible. So the mobility dimension is the key thing to think about. I wrote about this in 2006. I was just finding out what I wrote about the last ID card system, and I've forgotten it
Wow.
all, of course. But if you go to Woodhousen national ID cards or something like that, and you know how to spell my name, which I'll admit is tricky, you'll find it, and it's mostly right. So that's the thing to look after. They really are trying to restrict mobility more than they're trying to do Big Brother.
On that then, James, and to bring proceedings to a close, I wonder if you have any reflections on, I don't want to say the direction of channel because that's far too broad a question, and we'll be together for probably the whole weekend, James. But a lot of people would feel really, really quite sort of despondent, I think is the word I would use. A lot of people feel, oh, our lives are being taken over by all of this new technology. My generation would perhaps be minded to say, look, I do everything on this phone. To be honest with you, James, I'm not without this phone ever. I probably do pretty much absolutely everything on it. And my generation would probably be a little bit more relaxed about the idea of a digital ID being on your phone because our lives have been lived on these smartphones, potentially my generation being the first generation for that to have been the case. Do you think that the future then is one where we're heading down this sort of illiberal authoritarian dystopia, sort of think that Blade Runner style, or is the future one where we have tech as convenience, tech as a friend, not foe, and the idea of creating these digital currency systems, the central banks controlling our money, the banks being able to say, I mean, actually, James, I'll give you an example. I was banned off the app Tinder, right? Tinder being a dating app.
I should hope so.
I was, and I think that was totally down to my conservative views, not down to me being some dodgy bugger. I promise I'm not. And I think that was down to my conservative views. What do we do in the future, James? And this, I guess, is a really quite philosophical question. If banks are able to say, well, I will deny you a bank account because I've seen what you've been putting on your Twitter account, for example. We saw that sort of thing happen perhaps to Donald Trump and I believe to Kanye West as well, the rapper who's got himself in a fair bit of hot water over some comments he's made. You see conundrums like that and you start to see why people are arguing that we're not heading down a very nice future. Who's got it right? The liberal sort of young people who are saying, yep, this is a path to convenience and a better life. It's going to make efficiencies. It's going to make a hell of a lot of productivity problems go away. Or do you side with those who are saying, right, well, we are on this Blade Runner future in which you have to have identikit views. You have to be a good little citizen. Otherwise, you're up shit creek without a paddle, to be frank.
Well, we're not headed for Blade Runner. Science fiction has a big impact on the imagination. But, Rossum's Universal Robots was published in the 20s by Karel Čapek, the Czech author, and there's no robot taking your job anytime soon, Darren. So, it's important not to be the slaves of ideas promulgated many years ago and unconscious about it. To his credit, John Maynard Keynes said that. He got everything largely wrong, but that was right. We do labour under past ideologies. Now, like I said before, the guard against despondency is if we'd only worked harder at it, better at it, done more forensic research, been funnier about it, as I've tried to be today, then young people wouldn't be acquiescing to the degree that you say they are. I suspect that idea as well. I mean, when I go to the shops, old people are on their mobiles big time, not, as much as young people, and they can afford it more. So I don't see, the generational split is there, but it's not that great. And nobody's really made the argument to young people except the conspiracy argument against such a system. And young people know nothing generally because of their teachers, about threats to civil liberties. They're not really, bothered by that to the degree that they should be. They know very little of history because they've been taught Adolf Hitler endlessly, but they still don't understand, what fascism was and why we haven't got it at the moment, and we're unlikely to get it. But there's still many other threats to civil liberties. So that's among our young people and our despondent friends. There's no reason to be despondent. We haven't begun the struggle. On the other side, as I tried to say about the Chinese social credit system, we're not headed for Blade Runner. They can't organise that. They got a war on their hands. They got, all kinds of terrorists coming into the country, as we've learnt, Iranian and so on. So they're not organising a mass surveillance system, where from morning till night, even our sleep is being watched. They can't do that. They haven't got the money to do that. They've got other priorities in life. What they're doing is holding out these technological dreams in the hope, the mistaken hope, of cohering, taxpayers, younger people, naïves, around the idea of, we believe in the future. Children are the future. Brilliant observation by Tony Blair. Some people labour under the misapprehension that children are the past. But no, children and IT are the future. And if you're facing big problems of legitimacy, which Tony Blair really is, and the government really is, the Tories are, why not, uphold something you know nothing about but has a nice gleaming air to it, innovation, AI, IT. I know a lot more about it, that stuff, than they do. And it's much more difficult than they imagine because they never, been in a laboratory except with a yellow high-vis jacket to show off to the press. They never worked in a laboratory. It's very tough, really tough. Programming is tough, I programmed with punch cards, COBOL, a long time ago. I'm a dinosaur. I can tell you, I got a physics degree. It's tough, really tough. So let's be cool about it. Let's stand back from it.
James, I think that's quite an optimistic end to end this conversation on, because I think a lot of people watching this may well be clicking onto it in despair, worried about all of this. But yeah, your message is don't despair, and I think that's a really important one that needs to be heard more, James. So thank you very much for your time today. Now, what is your website URL? I'm going to have to put that in the description. So I'm letting people know now that I'm going to put a link to your website in the description so people can scout out your previous writing on this very issue.
It's www. You've got to be really hip to say that. But that's faster than www. www.woodhausen.com. Couldn't be any easier.
Easy.
Got two U's in Woodhausen there. Wacky name, wacky guy.
Well, that's it. Perfect. James, thank you very much for your time.
You were great, Darren. Thank you so much.
Reasoned relies upon grassroots donations from people like yourself that want us to continue producing our high quality, free thinking content. So please do consider clicking the link and donating, no matter how big, no matter how small, because it really does ensure that we can keep on keeping on.